Hello everyone and welcome back to ASP.NET Core 1.0. My name is Steve Bishop, and in this video I'm going to introduce you to some helpful tools that I use in my everyday work to try to investigate some of the different inner workings of MVC. Now I know this seems a little early to be introducing you to some tools that you guys are going to find useful, or perhaps it's a little late. Maybe you guys wanted to see what these tools were even further ahead of time. But really, I think this is the right time to introduce you to these things because we're starting to get to some things where I'm going to show you some in-depth material about your controllers and about your interaction with your web server that you're going to need to understand. So first of all, these tools are there just to help you. You don't have to have them. They're certainly not required. But I'm telling you right now that using these tools will become very helpful to your understanding of how MVC works and how you can interact with MVC. The first tool I'm going to introduce you to is Telerik's Fiddler. And Fiddler allows you to create your requests and inspect responses. So this is a tool that allows you to create an HTTP request, send that off to your web server, and then receive the response in Fiddler and inspect everything about that response. So you can see all of the headers and the body and anything else that might be associated with that response, as well as the request. So you can be very thorough and exacting about how you want to format your request to your web server. And that becomes very important when you start to deal with web API. Now, Fiddler is also helpful because it monitors your web browser communication with web servers. So you can see all of the different tunneling that's going on to all of the different services that a web server might be pointing you to. Because sometimes web servers go to other things, other APIs out there in the wild, and you need to know where those other services are located. Well, we'll be able to see all of that. We can monitor all of those pieces of communication that are happening between your web browser and web servers by using Fiddler. So the other tool I want to introduce you to is ILSpy. And ILSpy is very helpful because it allows you to inspect DLL assembly files. So if you have a dynamic link library file that has a bunch of .NET classes in it, and you want to know exactly how those classes work, you can use ILSpy to investigate those things. Because when you open up a dynamic link library in Visual Studio, or you have some sort of reference to a DLL in Visual Studio, you're only really given the signatures of that DLL. You can only see the properties with their gets and sets, as well as the method signatures, like what do you need to pass into those methods. But you're not necessarily able to see what's happening behind the scenes. What's the code that's going on behind each method and behind each get and set accessor of a property. And sometimes that's important to know. Typically, developers don't necessarily want you to see all of that, but I find sometimes if I really want to know what a method is doing so that I can figure out how I can use it to its fullest extent, I need to be able to see what's going on behind the scenes of those different members of a class. And ILSpy allows you to do that. So we'll take a look at a couple examples of using Fiddler and ILSpy right now. So to get Fiddler, you're going to want to go to telerik.com/Fiddler. And Telerik is spelled T-E-L-E-R-I-K. And from here, you could just click on the free download button. And you can see Fiddler for Net 4, which is the one that we're going to want. And you're going to need to fill in your email address. And you're going to need to select I accept the end user license agreement before you're going to be able to download Fiddler. So I'm going to fill that information out and click on download Fiddler. And right away it's going to go ahead and download the file, and it's a pretty small installation package. It's very small. I'm going to click on the run and yes. And of course I need to accept the license agreement, and I'm going to go ahead and install to the default location. And you can see the installation is very fast. It's a small installation package. It's not very big at all. So I'm going to close all those windows, and if I click on Start and Fiddler 4, and it'll go ahead and open up Fiddler the first time, and you'll get this little warning message, which just says that it's trying to capture traffic from Edge browser or Internet Explorer or other things like that. You want to go ahead and click on yes, because you do want it to capture all that information. And now it's going to open up this blog post on Microsoft.com. By default, at least this version of Fiddler opens up this browser. And you can see in our Fiddler web debugger, here on the left-hand side are all of our requests and responses. So these are requests and responses that happen automatically. These are happening in the background. And anytime I open up my web browser and go to a web page, so let's just go to our Google website here. If I look in here in Fiddler, you can see there is a request to google.com, and it resulted in a 302. And I can even look at the statistics of my request, so we can see how fast, how many bytes were sent and received, how fast was my request and response. And if I double click on it, we'll actually be able to look a bit more at a bit more information. So we see here's my request header. So it was a GET request of type HTTP /1.1. And I said the web browser was saying that it's willing to accept a type text HTML or application XHTML with all of these different parameters, or it can accept an image, and it accepts encoding of gzip, and it accepts English as my language. And here is the user agent Mozilla and all that great information there. So those are all the different user agents that Edge can use, as well as any cookies that are getting stored. So we can really see a lot, or excuse me, these are cookies that are being passed to the server, excuse me. So these are the requests, the pieces of information that we are sending along with our request to google.com. And Google's response here is down below. It said 302 found, and that actually meant that there should be a redirect. There's some sort of found, and there's actually a new location that you need to go to, which is this HTTPS google.com /GWS redirect equals SSL. And that's why we got this redirect when we open up google.com to this URL here, is because the transport location response was to that new URL, and a response of 302 just basically told my browser, we found a result for where you need to go. Here is the new location to go to. So that's a request header and a response that happened automatically behind the scenes of my web browser request to google.com. I can also go ahead and open up my application now, but I'm going to be sure not to just go up here where I have the debugging, because I don't want to open up with debugger. It'll end up filling up with a lot of debugging and diagnostics information, because there's a bunch of requests and responses that go back and forth here. So I'm going to go and open this up by going to debug, start without debugging, and that will open up our application without that debugging module on it. But our application will still work, so I can go to localhost 52577, and I can view that request and response right here in my Fiddler window. So we got a 200 result, and if I just click on it once to highlight it here, you can see our request header, which was similar to the same request that we made to google.com, and our response that we got back was a 200 OK. And you can see that the content was encoded with gzip. So this whole encoding with gzip happens automatically behind the scenes as part of MVC, where if the browser requests, it accepts an encoding of gzip, it can send the response also as gzip, so that it compresses the data into smaller length file size. So you're not getting the actual HTML code that came as part of our index home. So we had this here for our HTML that we were sending back. It's actually encoded in gzip. And to see this gzip encoding decoded, you're going to want to click on this response body is encoded, click to decode. If I click on that, then we'll be able to actually see in the text view tab here the actual body result that was sent back. So that's what the whole gzip thing is for. It's a way of compressing and encoding your request and response. And now in text view, after I decompress it or de-encode it, I can actually see the same HTML markup language that was sent back by my web browser. I can also go to the raw section here, and I can see the full response back. So these are the response headers that were sent back, as well as the body of the response. So this is a lot of information to probably take on here, but you can see we can get some really in-depth understanding of what's going on with our web browser, what it's doing behind the scenes, and the result that we get back as a response from our web server. We can even take it one step further, and if I click on the Compose tab here, or the Composer tab, I can actually go to the URL directly without using my web browser and instead do it in Fiddler. I want to make this a GET request, but notice I have a drop down where I can change the action type from GET to POST to PUT to DELETE or any of these other type of actions. And this is, again, very helpful for things to do specifically with Web API. This becomes very important to do. But now you can actually make your GET action and POST actions right here inside of the Composer to be very specific and manipulate the data of how you want to format your request to your web server. And this becomes very important later on when you start to deal with the different values that you pass along to your server as parameters to your methods. So we're going to pass along a GET request to our main host address here, which should just be our home server, or our home address, excuse me, and we can just double click on this and open up, once again, text view. There's the body of our response. Now we can do the same thing here in our Composer, but we're going to do members member home, and now we'll get a 200 for it that gives us a response of this is a members only section, which is that not access granted, it was members only section. There we go. So we have a member home. This is a members only section, which is exactly the HTML that we expected to receive back. So that's it for Fiddler. There's a lot there that's happening, and I'm sure that you have some questions about Fiddler, but we will be using Fiddler every once in a while in this series, and I just really wanted to get you acquainted and familiar with what it does and how it can be used. So let's go ahead and close Fiddler. I'm going to go to File and Exit, and I'm going to open up my web browser now, and we're going to go to ilspy.net. Now, ilspy.net, you're going to want to download the binaries of ilspy, and it comes as a zip file. So I'm going to go ahead and just open the folder where it was saved to, which should be my downloads folder. And I'm going to go ahead and extract this, and I'm going to put it into a folder on my C drive. And I'm just going to call it ilspy master, that's fine. And go ahead and extract it. And I'm also going to put a shortcut to this on my desktop. So it doesn't really install in a typical fashion. It's just a set of binary files and DLL files. And because of that, it doesn't do the full installation to your programs and applications that you're used to. Go ahead and close all that information down. Keep my Visual Studio open though. And here we go. There's ilspy on my desktop. I'm going to go ahead and double click and open ilspy. And you can see that we have a bunch of libraries that are already pre-opened by ilspy. So to see the usefulness of ilspy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Visual Studio and go to Home Controller. And on my Home Controller, we can see that it derives from a class controller. I'm going to right-click on this controller class and go to Definition. And you can see that since this is really part of an assembly, we only have the signatures. We only have the signature of the action context, which tells us that it's a get set, but we don't see anything like the underlying private property, the backing property behind it. And if we try to look and expand any of these methods, we don't get any of the values behind it. These are just really abstract classes. That's all this is just kind of abstract class. That's why it's called an abstract class. So we're not really seeing anything that's happening behind the scenes. We don't see any of the code behind each one of these methods, and we can't really get to it. It's very, very difficult. So what I'm going to do is, if you expand up here at the assembly information, we can see the folder location of where the dynamic link library is that contains this class. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to go to ILSpy, and I'm going to go ahead and open that dynamic link library. And here we can see, if we expand this out, we get all of the namespaces that are part of that dynamic link library called Microsoft.ASP.NET.MVC View Features. So we can see all of the different namespaces, and we can expand these out to see the different classes, including our controller class, as well as any interfaces. And we can expand this diagnostics section and see those classes. And we can really start to investigate all of the different components that make up that dynamic link library. And so I'm going to go back to the controller class, which resides under Microsoft.ASP.NET.MVC. And the reason we know this is not just because we just happen to come across it, but if you actually look inside of the controller abstract class, we can see that the namespace, namespace is Microsoft.ASP.NET.MVC. So that's how you can find that is the namespace I would need to expand to find this class of controller. And once I open up controller, we can start to see there are the backing classes. We have action context. We have iService provider is, the resolver property is a type of iService provider. Here's the get accessor, which simply returns if express 06 equals null, return null, etc., etc. Otherwise, it returns HTTP context. If we scroll down here, and I'm going to keep looking for, we got claims principal user is another property. So there's more properties there. So here's view result. There's our view action, which just simply returns this view with null being passed into the view method. So it's looking at view and passing in a no value into view. We have view with a string for a view name. So if we passed along a string to the name of the view that we want to display, then we can see that it just calls view method on this class, and it passes along the string with null object. Okay, so it's passing null as a second parameter, and I can tell you right now that that just means that's the object that would be passed in as a model, which if you just pass in a view name, then you're not passing in a model, and therefore it's null. And we could just pass into the view an object, and it calls it model. And you can see just similarly, it's going to pass into this view method null as the view name. So there's a blank view name, but it is passing in a model. So then we get to view result here for view method, and we can see there's both the string and the object model. So all of those other view methods ultimately result in this one here, which just says passing in a view name, which could have been null, but it also passes in a model object, which could also be null. And this is the actual code that's going to run ultimately from all of those different view methods. And it says return new view result, and it passes along into that new view result object a view name, and sets view name equal to the view name, and sets view data equal to view data, and sets temp data equal to temp data. So you can see we can actually dig in and see the actual code that's happening behind this view method, that if we look at the abstract class, let me kind of minimize this down here. Let's find our view. There we go. So those are all of our view methods, but they're all abstract and they don't tell us anything. They don't tell us any of the code that's happening behind each one of these, but they do Here, you can see the actual code happening behind those methods right there inside of ILSpy. So there you go. That's why ILSpy is very useful, very handy, because it tells you exactly what's going on behind the scenes. You can't change any of this. You can't, unless you're going to override these methods, you can't change them. So we're just investigating to see what's happening so that we get a better understanding of how these classes are operating. But you're not going to be able to change any of it, but you could override it theoretically. So there you go. That is an example of how you can use both Fiddler to understand your communication with your web server, and ILSpy, which actually shows you inside of the dynamic link libraries all the classes, methods, and interfaces that you are going to be dealing with, and actually see the code behind those methods and behind those properties. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you guys understand these tools, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of questions about how to use them and how useful they really are. But trust me, the sooner you get them, the sooner you get more comfortable with these two tools, the more you're going to love them and have the love the understanding that comes with having these tools at your disposal.